There are many advantages to drawing on panels rather than paper, and in this video I do 3 different demonstrations. In the first demo I use Aquabord to do a line and wash watercolor painting. I start out with marker and then I go over it with watercolor. Since the Aquabord is absorbent, the marker doesn't smear at all. In the second demo I use Encausticbord to do a graphite drawing of the still life. Encausticbord is thicker and it has a very velvety surface. It works really well for graphite. In the final demo, I do a Crayon drawing of this boat on Pastelbord. Pastelbord has a really nice gritty surface and it works well with charcoal, Crayon, or pastels. Line and wash is a watercolor technique where you do the drawing with a marker and then you go over it with watercolor washes. It's one of my favorite techniques for drawing in a sketchbook, but you can also do it on a wood panel. Aquabord works really well for that because it has a clay coating on there that's absorbent. So here's a Gessobord where I drew on it with some markers, and you can see that applying water to it smears the ink. And that's not what we want because that'll gray your colors. Here's another sample, but this is Aquabord, and I drew on there with the same markers, and when I painted over it with watercolor, it didn't smear. So this works really well. I have a Staedtler pigment liner. This is the 0.5. And I'll just do the fine lines first. I started with a pencil drawing just so I know where all my shapes are, and then I go back in it with ink. That way you don't have to do too many corrections with the ink. You can also use micron pens, it's just a different brand. This one has a finer point. This is the finest micron that I have, and I'll put in some of the finer details with it. I usually put in the fine details first, and then I come back with thicker markers to put in like bolder lines. I sometimes use a ruler to put in the straight lines. It's easier to put in the details like these windows with a pen like this rather than trying to put that in there with a fine brush. I have all the fine lines in, now I'll go back in and put in some thicker lines. I like this Pentel brush pen. It has like bristles at the end and it has a replaceable cartridge so you can refill it when you run out of ink. I like how you can get some dry brushing texture with this. You can get like this broken line which has a nice look to it. Another option is this big brush pen from Faber-Castell. It has a fine point, but you can also use the broad side of it to get thicker lines. I finished off the drawing with these bold lines. And before I go into it with watercolor, I want to make sure that it's totally dry. So I'll use a hairdryer to dry that off. I'll start by wetting some of these water areas. I'll put a little bit of cerulean in there so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'll load my brush up with the cerulean blue. I'll just continue the same thing on the other side. When you have it wet like that, you can get the paint to flow a little bit better. You can also take some of this ultramarine blue and put it in there if I want some areas that are darker. I got a drip on there in an area that I don't want it in, but it's easy to lift it with a paper towel. That's what's nice about this Aquabord. I switched to a larger brush for this big section here. Just trying to get this area wet so I can get the paint to flow. Preserving the white of these boat masks can be a real challenge. Normally you'd have to paint around them, use masking fluid, or paint them in with white gouache. Another advantage of the Aquabord is that you can scratch them in when the paint is dry, which I'll demonstrate later in the video. I have some like purple mixed up here. It's quinacridone magenta with the ultramarine, and I could put that in some of these shadow areas too. You notice that even if I scrub this, the ink isn't coming off. I'm just trying to get variation in this water. There are areas that are like lighter and some are darker. This darker color is ultramarine blue with a little bit of burnt sienna and quinacridone magenta. If you want to make an area lighter, lifting is pretty easy. You just scrub some water into it, then wipe it away. I think it's a good time to put in some of the shadows on these boats. It's mostly the same purple mixture of ultramarine and quinacridone. The cool thing about these Aquabords is you can lift really well, and I can like lighten this area up if I want to. So this boat in the foreground has a red stripe around the outside edge. Another advantage of using Aquabord is you can scratch fine lines into the paint. I have this scratchboard toolkit. It has different tools in there for drawing on scratchboards, but you can also use them on Aquabords. Instead of painting these fine lines in with a brush, which is difficult to do, you can just scratch into it with one of these tools. That's an advantage because instead of painting around all these masks, I could just scratch back into it. Plus, it's really easy to draw straight lines using a ruler. For this graphite drawing demo, I used Encausticbord. I like to think of this as like premium Gessobord. For one, it's thicker, and that's because it's made for working with encaustic, which requires a lot of heat, so it won't warp. But it also has a surface that's kind of velvety. It's more matte than the Gessobord, and the texture is very fine and regular. You can get some nice blending with this, and I like the little bit of texture that you can get with it if you don't blend it. So let's get started. I sketched out the composition and then transferred it to the Encausticbord using transfer paper. You can also draw directly onto the board. This is just a 2H pencil. I use it for the majority of the drawing. And what I do is I shade it, and it has somewhat of a coarse look from the texture. You can see there's texture in there, but when I go over it with the blending stump, you get a much smoother appearance. You can leave the texture if that's what you want for a certain area. But since this is mostly glass, which is smooth, I'm using the blending stump. One of the most challenging parts of a drawing like this is creating a smooth background. For the most part, I lightly fill those areas in with the pencil and then use the blending stump to smooth it out. There are other ways to achieve smooth backgrounds and gradients. You can use graphite powder and a brush, which can be faster, although sometimes it can be a little bit messy to work with. If you want to try that out, you can buy graphite powder or make your own. I usually go a little bit lighter than I think it should be, and then when I have it all filled in, it's easier to judge the values against each other, and I usually end up going back and making some areas darker. It also helps to pay attention to the point that you have on your pencil. For hard edges and details, you want a sharp point, but for when I do smoother blending, I want a more blunt point. I made a whole video about pencil sharpeners. You can watch that next if you're interested. In this last demo, I used Pastelbord to draw with Conte Crayon. Of course, you can use it for pastels, but it also works with charcoal. What makes this different than Gessobord is that it has a very fine texture to it. It's almost like fine sandpaper. So when you draw on it with a Conte Crayon or a pastel, it really takes the pigment well. Here's the finished drawing when I sealed it, and you can see when I rub my hand over it, none of it comes off, so it's protected. At first I concentrate on putting in the basic shapes, then I go back in and add more details. Conte crayons are also available in stick form, which is nice for filling in larger areas. You can also draw with the edge of the crayon to create broad strokes that have some texture to them. You can use a blending stump or a rag to create smoother blends. Highlights can be pulled out by erasing the darker areas with a kneaded eraser. I sprayed the drawing with several coats of Spectrafix and allowed it to dry overnight. Once it's fully cured, it's possible to apply a coat of their natural glass product with a brush. You don't really want to go over it too much or else you might disturb the previous layer. I have a full tutorial on how I seal my gouache paintings, and it also works for drawings. One word about sealing your drawings is you want to conduct a lot of tests. You don't want to spend a lot of time on a drawing and then ruin it when you seal it. Ampersand recommends a sealer from Crayon, but I also use Spectrafix, which is casein based. But definitely test it out on the substrate you're going to use with the materials you plan on using. That way there's no surprises. Up next, you can watch my video about how to seal gouache paintings, which also works for drawings. You might also want to watch my pencil sharpener review. Please like this video if you found it useful. Thanks for watching.